Clean Transportation Prizes. There's an introductory poll that's happening on the chat page that you can take a look at, and we'd love for you to participate. I'd like to mention that everybody is welcome to introduce themselves, their organization, and whether you're looking for partners in the chat space of the screen. I'd like to give you a brief overview of the New York Clean Transportation Prizes. My name is Louisa Friedman, and I'm working on this at NYSERDA with Robin Marquis. The New York Clean Transportation Prizes are led by New York State Energy Research and Development Authority in partnership with the New York State Department of Public Service and the Department of Environmental Conservation. This program will support electrifying transportation, reducing air pollution, and enhancing clean mobility in underserved communities across New York State. The prizes provide teams of global experts with the opportunity to directly engage with these communities to improve and scale clean transportation options locally and across New York State and beyond. The 3 prize competitions include the Clean Neighborhoods Challenge to award innovative projects that address local air pollution reduction at scale, the Electric Mobility Challenge to award projects that demonstrate innovative, safe, convenient, active, and electric mobility options that meet community needs, and the Electric Truck and Bus Challenge to award projects that demonstrate replicable pathways to reduce the cost, system, and operational challenges of further deployment of medium and heavy-duty electric vehicles, including charging and grid integration. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the prize website. We'd like to suggest that you use the Q&A feature to ask questions, and we'll address them at the end. It's important that you look at the New York Clean Transportation Prizes.org to apply for the prizes and spread the word. Next slide, please. Here's information about where you can find the materials, the recording of the webinar, and post questions as well that aren't answered in the chat. I'd like to now introduce our moderator for the session. Next slide, please. Shanika Amarcone is a senior environmental and climate justice practice lead at Eastern Research Group. Shanika leads the environmental and climate justice solutions practice. She brings over 20 years of experience forming and leading multidisciplinary teams to support federal and state analyses related to climate change, renewable energy, and sustainability. She currently serves as the project manager for NYSERDA's Clean Transportation Prize outreach and stakeholder engagement for disadvantaged communities. I'd like to turn it over to Shanika. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Louisa. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'm very excited to moderate this panel on successful partnerships and teaming. If you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And the next slide. Thank you. So before we get started on our panel discussion, I thought it would be helpful to provide more context on the New York Clean Transportation Prize goal, including the definition of disadvantaged communities and Eastern Research Group's role in supporting the prize program. I'll also share some tips for partnering with community-based organizations that may be useful in developing, forming your teams and developing your application. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a key goal, as Louisa mentioned, for the Clean Transportation Prize is to deliver benefits to disadvantaged communities. Disadvantaged communities is a term used in New York's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act and includes environmental justice or low moderate income communities located in New York State Opportunity Zones. New York Climate Act recognizes that greenhouse gas emission reduction targets cannot be met without engaging and benefiting these communities. So the map on this slide highlights these target, or what we like to call priority communities, in green. And A link to this map is available on the Clean Transportation Prize website and through this link that we've included on the slide, which will also be included in the chat. Next slide, please. Eastern Research Group, including our teaming partners, Hummingbird and Consensus Building Institute, are working with NYSERDA to support outreach and engagement with these priority communities, including community-based organizations, or CBOs, that may be interested in partnering. CBOs in particular will play a key role in supporting the Clean Transportation Prize by engaging the communities in which they have already established networks, connections, and trust. The ERG team's role is to help make sure CBOs understand the value and benefits of the program and support their engagement to in turn ensure the goals of diversity, inclusion, and equity are met. And while I always think that diversity and inclusion are relatively straightforward and for people to understand, the goal of equity isn't always straightforward. So this graphic that I have on the right helps to illustrate understanding the difference between equality versus equity. It's not just about leveling the playing field. It's about providing additional support where needed to make sure all partners have equal access to information so that they can in turn ensure that the Clean Transportation Prize proposals benefit their community. Next slide, please. So the intent of this webinar, as we mentioned, is to offer some tips and suggestions, best practices on successful partnerships and teaming with communities and community-based organizations. And what we did was pull together some highlights of do's and don'ts, and I'm not going to go into all of them in detail. But it's really important to understand that depending on the community-based organization that may be working with that community can be very different. Sometimes they are just groups of volunteers that are working together during the evening with their day jobs. Sometimes they do have more resources available, but oftentimes, or they have a stronger foundation and are have more resources and capacity, but oftentimes they have limited capacity. So it's really important to be aware and conscious of that. So in terms of the key do with respect to working with community-based organizations, listening with awareness is one of the most important, and certainly seeking to understand versus to be understood. And I realize some of these may seem like common sense, but I can't emphasize how important this is. Seeking to also understand the community, their needs, their stresses, their attributes. So because so many community-based organizations may not have all the resources that they need or staff, it's sometimes we recommend entering into some type of partnership agreement where you can be clear on the time and resources that may be needed to support a proposed project. In terms of the don'ts, definitely don't go in assuming you have all the answers or the right ideas. Don't focus on community deficits or assuming that you're going to go in and save the community, and don't assume any instant partnership or instant trust. It really takes time, and so the more you engage and actively listen, the more likely that trust and partnership will build on a solid foundation. So next slide, please. So here with me to talk about some of more best practices and tips and examples for building partnerships are three panelists. And I'll briefly read their bios and then we'll start off with some questions. Elle Ramel is the Chicago Director for Gender Equity in Tech Cities, a city-based initiative to advance women in the tech economy. Prior to this, she managed the redevelopment of the Michael Reese Hospital site for Farpoint Development and led strategic partnerships at City Tech Collaborative, the Smart City Lab of Chicago, and was the Economic Policy Associate in Mayor Rahm Emanuel's office in the city of Chicago. Steve Gutman is a Senior Program Manager at Forth. Forth is advancing electric, smart, and shared mobility through innovation, demonstration, advocacy, and engagement. Steve has also worked in advisory, business development, and sales roles at several early and growth stage clean tech companies and car sharing services such as GetAround and Zipcar. He also has a background in energy efficiency, finance, carbon markets, trading, and equipment leasing. Nicole Payne is an urban planner for New York City. From scooter share to cashless tolling, Nicole has worked throughout New York City and with municipalities across North America to develop transportation initiatives that address barriers to mobility for low income and communities of color. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me. And if everyone can turn their videos on, great. Great. So first question, which I'll direct to Elle. What are some of the partnership strategies that you've seen be effective on projects similar to the New York Clean Transportation Prizes?
Thank you, Shanika, so much for having me. When I think about partnerships, I think about really first assessing, as a partnerships background, first assessing all the potential partners, both government, private sector, nonprofit, just really understanding the landscape, understanding each current role an individual or community organization plays, and then really thinking about bringing diverse perspectives and backgrounds to a project. So I worked on the Michael Reese project, which was an 80-acre real estate development project, and we were thinking about getting that ready for electric vehicles. You have to think about not only who are the users of those vehicles, who is going to build those stations, what are the size of the roads. So it's not just, oh, I hope I can bring electric vehicles to a community. You're thinking about, are they going to park at the park? Are there children involved? So I think you're just expanding that mindset of both the user and the provider in one conversation in these kind of projects.
Thank you, Elle. Nicole?
Yes, I totally everything. Just I think especially about the diversity of backgrounds, your different partnership bring different strengths and skills to the partnership. And I think something very important that Elle touched on was the human aspect of these types of projects. So innovation is great. Innovation for innovation's sake is interesting, but we're really trying to address those human needs, those to people's livelihood or economic status or social status within their communities.
Thank you. That's such a good point. So in terms of some of the team configurations that should be considered for the transportation projects, how do you see the roles of different participating individuals and organizations? Nicole, do you care to elaborate on that?
Absolutely. And my bio was a little bit vague because from the beginning of being asked to present to this to now roles. So my former roles with the National Association of City Transportation Officials and work with cities across the country on shared bike and shared scooter projects to address barriers to mobility and that achieved the most success were partnerships that had so that is a private operator, of course, or the element of your partnership that's bringing the technology, the content expertise, usually a nonprofit or community partner. Sometimes those are the same thing, sometimes those are not. It may look like a think tank, for example, or maybe you're working with a transportation focused advocacy group. Sometimes there are communities live in New York City. Maybe there's a community board that is really in touch with communities' mobility partner. Of course, some form of local government or some form of an entity that has, I won't say power, but has influence on how streets are used. So for some partnerships that may look like a BID, business improvement district. For some folks that may look like a city. You need all of those components to make sure you're not missing anything. You're not missing the human element. You're not missing the regulatory element of things. And of course, you have that technical expertise as well.
Thank you, Nicole. Steve, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I actually think that that Nicole hit all the points that I would make in response to that question. The only couple of additional partners might be well, certainly for transportation electrification, the local utility is super important, not only because they often have resources that they can bring to bear, but they also are just going to be super important for charging and but also for financial resources, and they are going to know where the grid has capacity and where it doesn't have capacity and that sort of thing. So I think it's very important to bring the utilities into the conversation. We also generally try to bring in some sort of a partner with deep sort of data analytics experience, because in many of these projects, they tend to be very, very data heavy. And when you're at the end of the project and want to report out in terms of how it went, it's often really helpful to have like a university or a lab or an engineering firm that specializes in data analytics to help you make the case for what happened as a result of your project.
Great, thank you. Anyone else have any thoughts before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I'll jump in there, Steve. I think you bring up a great point. I think data analytics is incredibly important. I also think having a translational element, whether that's someone in communications, graphic design, data visualization, one of the more effective things we've been able to work with data visualization groups is really showing, especially transportation, it's, you know, it's fluid dynamics, it's very complicated and energy outputs. So getting some really clean visuals of that data and telling that story is often worth almost, you know, 1,000 data points, because then someone can legibly read it, the newspapers can pick it up. So I think there's also wins in the translational space as well. And moving away from acronyms, bringing that human element, telling that story, like Nicole said, someone using that scooter, someone saving money on an electric bill. I mean, those are just such wins as well.
Great, thank you. That's such a good point. In terms of some of the opportunities and risks when putting together a great team for transportation, well, what are some of those opportunities and risks when putting together a great team for a transportation electrification project? Steve?
I guess the opportunities that we come across over and over again through partnerships is, well, one of them is just the ability to learn new things and to stretch ourselves and really to you know, to bring new technologies to parts of the country and communities where they're still very, very new. But so it's bringing new technology, but also stretching ourselves as an organization and learning new things, especially if we work closely with great partners. On the risks side, I think we've found that, you know, oftentimes a project that we're envisioning sounds simpler than it is. And so I think it's easy to assume that, you know, for example, doing a car share project is going to be very simple. It sounds simple in theory, but unless you've actually done that sort of shared mobility work, it's easy to assume that from the outside, a well-running shared mobility service runs pretty seamlessly. But what you often fail to realize when doing these things, when looking at these things from the outside, is that people internally are typically working really, really hard. So don't assume that a project is easy. Don't assume that you can do something that you've never done before. And also be really careful about the technical partners that you choose, and make sure to vet them carefully and check references. Ideally, you don't want to be the first entity to work with a technical partner that's developing a new technology, because things inevitably can and will go wrong. So.
Thanks, Steve. So you mentioned risk in terms of, you know, avoiding in terms of really exploring the risks, and you mentioned references as one way to kind of help to understand what those may be. Do you have any other tips or suggestions, or maybe any of the other panelists, on how you can really truly assess risk?
I think one thing is to be very aware of the ability for longevity as well, getting a sense for how long a partner can be in this and how dynamically they can evolve. We only know what's happening right now. Transportation is changing every year. But it also, I always love lawyers because, also scripting a way for people to enter a pilot or exit. If it's not a match anymore, you don't want to be trapped with a partner that's like, I'm here, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I think another thing to keep in mind is it flexible where keeping in mind procurement rules and the proprietary nature of technology, if you're going with a private sector partner or you're going with a government partner, there's speed to that, there's negotiation that will take, but you also want to make sure, can other vehicles participate in that district? Can they plug in? So I think at this point, it's very similar when electricity showed up. You want to just make sure that you're thinking about the ramifications of certain partnerships and how they can manifest on kind of like an open source concept in the future.
Anyone else have any thoughts before we move on to the next question related to opportunities and risks when putting together a team?
I think that one other risk I would point out, I think it's really important to do the hard work of figuring out your budget with your partners as early as possible and not leave that, to later on in the process. Don't fall in love with the ideas, but really, focus in on what is the scope and how are we dividing up the available funds early on, because otherwise you can run into, misunderstandings and disagreements, and you want to avoid that by being proactive around the budgeting.
Great, that's a good point. So what are some of the best practices from transportation, electrification, and infrastructure projects in other regions that you can share? Steve, do you have any best practices here?
A few things. I just mentioned, the importance of digging into the budget as soon as possible, right? Not necessarily right away. You have to have an idea before you develop a budget. I'd say that's one best practice. Another one that we've been doing more and more often at Fourth is conducting a needs assessment with the local community. Definitely don't sort of go in assuming you have the answer to anybody's problems. It's really important to do some listening and make sure that the problem that you're trying to address is a problem that it's not just in your mind, right? The solutions you're providing really should come from the community, and make sure that so be proactive in that sense. Another best practice you've already mentioned is involving local community-based organizations. We typically expect to compensate the CBOs for their participation. A lot of people seem to think that CBOs don't need to be paid for the work that they do, or they already have funding, but I think that's a really dangerous assumption. So expect to compensate them. And then the last thing I would say is, this is just my personal preference when working on a project like this, is frequent short meetings rather than infrequent long, 2-hour meetings with the project group. I try to take a page out of the tech industry and do, if possible, like even daily quick 20-minute meetings rather than waiting for weeks at a time between group meetings. So those are just some best practices from Fourth anyway.
Nicole, do you have any best practices that you can offer?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the last 2 to 3 of Steve's best practices, I want to put like an exclamation point on, because they're very critical, especially working with, I know the term used here is disadvantaged communities, communities of lower income, communities of color. Usually there's an overlap there. These are communities that have been historically given the short end of the stick in terms of distribution resources. So when going and working with communities, especially on transportation and mobility related projects, you have to understand, you have to be okay with the response that you receive may not be, yes, climate change or emissions is my number one issue in my life. Transportation might not even be that number one issue. I think the goal really is to figure out how your transportation project or the project you develop with community can meet the needs of those communities exists right now. An example will be, and I know we're going to get into case studies, but an example will be, well, actually, let me back up a little bit. especially in thinking about my background in shared micromobility, bikes and scooters specifically. The communities that we focused on within this projects do not have the infrastructure to support a lot of these projects. So you have to think before going into meetings with communities, that's going to come up. Like, oh, we've been asking for this stop sign for 35 years. Where is that? Or, we don't have enough space for bike lanes, or this road hasn't been repaved in 20 years. Those are questions very base questions that you're going to have to think about before meeting with community, because it's going to come up because they have not received the resources or attention that has been needed throughout history. And another thing would be to work with partners, kind of a blend of the last question as well. To work with either consultants or partners that do have some sort of race and class analysis. And that again ties to the point I just made about these are communities that have historically just been left out of resource distribution, have, in terms of their needs may not have been met by their local governments. They're going to want things, they're going to have questions about things. They're going to remember 15 years ago, someone came and said the same exact thing, what happened then? So that's something you're going to have to think about, and that's going to be a major portion of your project. And I think avoiding that is a huge risk, right? Because what's the point of rolling out this really great, awesome project if no one uses it? So I just wanted to add those 2 points in there as well.
I think to add to this, in my context, I'm sure it's the same in New York, but new technology always implies a potential for another job to be replaced. Think taxi drivers or bus drivers, so there's also the question. I mean, we see this in the federal context right now. Is yes, there's clean energy jobs coming. It's very exciting, but you're also going to have to account for nervousness in local communities about what does this mean for my uncle that does truck driving, or what does this mean for someone who is working with a fleet. I think those are things just to be prepared for answering. And Nicole, I love that analysis of those opportunities, but you have to break it down to those needs on the ground. It's not about the environment. The environment's the secondary, and it's great. It's how am I getting a job? How am I paying rent? Those are the things you're going to hear at those meetings.
That's right. And so just expanding on this, we've been talking about a lot of tips and best practices. Could you provide or share a story or a case study from a successful public-private partnership that you've been involved with? Elle, do you have one that you could share?
Yeah, of course. So when I was working at City Tech, so it's a an urban cities lab. There was a project. You realize these things that seem simple, but we did an underground infrastructure mapping project where we realized that when people drill in the ground, they don't know what they're hitting because the maps are all on paper at cities. So another thing to think about is where governments are coming from. They've got paper maps and they've got printers that are black and white. And so we were working with corporate partners with technology. We were working with construction groups, and we were also working with the City of Chicago government. So first, I think it's navigating what are the regulations or what are the ways things are done. So the city was, just sending a crew out. They'd look at the old map, they'd make a guess. There's 6 inches of error. So really convincing them this was going to save those construction crews time and money because they'd hit a pipe and the whole central business district would have an outage. So we made it a use case problem for the city. And we also made it for the construction crews. They don't want to be paying those insurance and they don't want to be wasting their time. So I think it was, when we were working with the construction trade unions, new technology, I don't know about that, but we solved a problem that they were experiencing day to day. And for the government, it was also costing the city a lot of money to keep the lights on every time we hit an electric line. So, I always like to reduce it to, what are those current day-to-day problems and what can everyone get behind where they say, this is worth my time. And this is so painful, I'm willing to work together.
Thank you so much. Nicole, do you have a case study that you could share?
Absolutely. And I think that case studies are really a model for these partnerships that we've been talking about this entire time. In that good things happen, usually good things happen when government, nonprofit, and private entities get together to address, as Elle just mentioned, an issue that everyone can get behind. I think the different partners may have different, they're focused on different outcomes, but an example of this would be There is a scooter operator that does a really good job of ensuring that their engagement is the forefront of their mobility programs, because they understand that these devices, these scooters, these bikes, these shared electric vehicles are new to a lot of economies, but are the key to not only their economic wealth of themselves in their city, but the social wellness as well. I'm sorry, economic wellness and social wellness. And what works well is that the private companies tend to have a lot more flexibility in terms of not needing to go through a bunch of red tape to do pop-up events, which are go into a community on a few days and say we're gonna, all right, made up example, but we're gonna do scooter education courses here. So the private companies have that perspective where there's a lot less red tape. In the government, believe it or not, does not have as much money to do outreach for very critical projects that they need to do. And then nonprofits and community groups, of course, have those critical relationships with the people that live in the communities that are the context experts on how they use their streets. So a really good example of this would be the scooter company does, they work with social justice focused consulting groups to develop pop-up events in cities where they're planning to roll out or they already have service. And these pop-up events are designed around gathering information from community members who are walking past. You ask them, what are your mobility needs? What do you need from the city? Have you heard about this project? It's an information share and information collection. So that meets the city's needs, right? They're like, oh, this is great. You all have the money. We've been meaning to ask these questions. And the private operator is able to introduce their service to community members. At the same time, often it's combined when it was in person with education courses as well. So this is how you use a helmet. This is how you brake when you're using a scooter, which are, again, those important safety elements that are critical for the government, of course, because, safety, public safety, very important. Important for the community-based organization to model, because they're your go-to and your point of contact for all things that are happening in the community. And then, of course, it works well for the operator as well, because that builds that brand familiarity and recognition. So really just working together to identify shared events or goals that will have different impacts on different partners has been very, very successful.
Thank you, Nicole. That's so interesting, the story. In terms of, and I'm going to throw this last question out to all the panelists. But what would you say your top piece of actionable advice is for putting together a successful project team? So I don't know, Steve, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I've already said it, I think, but I'll reiterate it. Dig into the budget as early as you can and because I think of a budget as almost like it's a sort of the outline of the project. If you were writing a paper, you want to write an outline first. If you're trying to plan a project, you want to figure out the budget, because I think if you start to carve up the budget, then you'll start to carve up the tasks, and then you'll quickly realize, oh, well, we need a partner to do this portion of the task. But I tend to think of the budget as being shorthand for the entire project. So that would be my main piece of advice. And by the way, I love Nicole's term context experts. I've heard content experts, but I haven't heard the term context experts for like local community members. I think that's a great term that I will use in the future.
Yes, I think one thing we're learning is terminology is important, and so nuances like that are subtle but important to recognize and be aware of. Just a quick follow-up, Steve, on your note about the budget. I had mentioned earlier on before the panel discussion about partnership agreements, and I realize they don't necessarily have to be really formal, but in your experience, have you basically used partnership agreements as part of these budget conversations?
Yeah. What we do is we try to, we decide on the budget, but then we also sort of draft an MOU that it's a non-binding, it's not like a legal agreement, but it's just a memorandum of understanding that gets on paper what every party to the partnership is going to do. And in there, you can also mention the portion of the budget that they will get. But I think as long as that's all clear and agreed to up front, it minimizes a lot of, headache and potential for disagreement later. So I would definitely put an MOU together with your partners.
Right. Elle, do you have any top pieces of advice you'd like to share?
First of all, I'm a huge fan of MOUs. I agree. I agree, Steve. A legal and a financial underpinning of what's happening instead of a we will be partners. Even understanding if there are groups that are more have holding more risk, if they're going to be investing more kind of in kind or pre-project dollar. Just understanding the ways that people are investing and then they'll be getting those returns. But I think another thing is to think, like we've spoken about, is there are partners that might not be the direct either subject matter expert or in clean tech. You want to think about, do I need a transportation planner? Am I going to need a government affairs consultant involved? Just thinking about the kind of ancillary or secondary nature of what you might need on your team is also very important when this team forms. And also, I really do. I have experience with the real estate projects. You want those in exits and entries to the project team where if someone says this isn't for me, you have a way to exit and you have a way to onboard someone else if needed over time.
And Nicole, any last pieces of advice you'd like to leave us with?
I think my co-panelists have done an excellent job in covering. Yeah, I just want to drive home the point because in my experience, background in government, but also nonprofit, hangups or project stalls, or even being required to, trash the project and start over happens when the community feels like they have not been engaged in the process, they're not aware of what's happening, or the right people are not brought into the process early enough. So I would think about those relationships early on, especially with the community. If you're bringing on a consultant, please make sure they know the community very, very well, if not from the community that you'll be working in. I think that is critical, critical, critical. This rarely happens, but you got everything right. And then if there's this super vocal person on your New York City community board that's like, whoa, what's this? We didn't hear about this, or whatever the issue may be, whether it's brought up that what we hear a lot, of course, with transportation projects is that what'll come next is gentrification. I'm being pushed out of my home because of this new investment in this resource, or this new thing is coming. That has caused projects to end. So I will just be very clear that it's something that needs to be prioritized. I know at times it can be difficult, but it is worth it. It is worth it. It is required. It is critical to build those relationships out front and prioritize those relationships. It's not just a check on a box, because one conversation with the right person can get your project ended. So
I want to add to that for Nicole. I also like to move very slowly and speak very loudly. So you can also let community groups know, hey, I'm sort of going to be moving through New York and I'm going to be doing this project. And I feel like if you have no surprises, community's like, I've been seeing you here the whole time. You don't surprise me. I think that's another thing, is just moving very slowly, but always like Steve said, 20-minute meetings, 20-minute updates, and then no one's surprised and then no one gets mad. So I always like to do that too.
great. What's the saying? Move at the speed of trust. I think again that showing up, that means it's like, oh, this, I know Elle. I'm not 2 months ago.
She's just over there sitting on that rock all the time. It's weird. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's something that I have found too, is taking the time to build the trust. And sometimes it just takes longer than you think it's going to take, and you just have to be patient, and you have to keep engaging and keep working on it. So thank you so much to all of our panelists. It's just really exciting to be here with all of you. We certainly wanted to leave some time for question and answer from those who are on the call. So I believe Louisa is going to moderate the question and answer session.
Great. Thank you, Shanika. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
And we're going to put the slide back up. Thank you, panelists. That was a great conversation. Innovation and practical solutions need to go hand in hand. I wanted to ask one follow-up question. Somebody mentioned a needs assessment. I think, Steve, that was you. And I'd like to know if others of you have examples of, what's a good way to get that community input through a more market research type needs assessment? What's the best way to reach out? What do people have time for? If you can have some advice on how to get that community input in a more systematic way. Maybe Steve, you mentioned it, and then the others, I'd be interested in hearing from you.
Yeah, well, it's always a problem, right? Everybody's really interested in projects, but the problem is with just going straight to a project is often you have a solution in search of a problem, right? You're bringing your existing solution into a situation where it may or may not be appropriate, and so we can't always get it, but if possible, we make a habit of trying to carve out some funding, usually in advance, to do a bit of a needs assessment, and that's usually entails bringing a very diverse group of stakeholders from the community together to try to identify, where are the needs. As Nicole said earlier, it may be as simple as a stop sign at an intersection that the community has wanted for years, and they may not be interested in whatever great project idea that you have, because they have more fundamental needs that they want to have it addressed first. And so I think it's really important. It's not super easy to get funding for needs assessments, but we feel like they're really important.
I can jump in as well. So just my background in community engagement, I think what's also important is getting very creative about being at constant engagement as well. I think there are merits to constant roundtables, but being very deliberate about survey scans on fences, going to schools, trying to grab people where some people can go to the after work meetings, some people can do an online space. I've worked with companies like Co-Urbanize, where you can have a platform that's regularly updating people all the time. And I think it's also the iteration. I think there's a lot of time where you want to go pre-project, ask people their thoughts, what they need, but even asking feedback throughout some of those small needs, like a stop sign. Your team could also, it's not exactly your scope, but finding those nonprofits in your city where they're already invested in that kind of work, and bringing that that problem statement to them. It might not be your funding or your project, but you can also exist in an ecosystem of neighborhood or region-based projects. And sometimes I think showing that your project team is also interfacing with other initiatives in the same region means a lot. So it's almost that constant of what are we hearing, what are the pain points. If it's not the thing that you can solve, it's elevating it to other allies and partners. And I think that's something to think about through your whole project.
I see a lot of nodding there from you, Nicole. Do you have anything to add?
My co-panels are just so amazing. I totally agree. He worked at the MTA and managed the outreach when cashless tolling was coming to New York. And I don't know if you all are drivers or you live in New York City, but you probably saw me at like Puerto Rican Day Parade or out in Coney Island, manning or personing a pop-up booth, giving out information. Those like random, like someone is there, of course, pre-COVID, post-COVID, when things are safe, but when someone is there consistently, either every other week or whatever the timetable may be, who is able to not only answer questions but also collect information from those conversations. So it could just be a one-off conversation, like what are your pain points, as Elle just mentioned, or have you heard about this project, what are your thoughts, or people are speeding on this road, what do you think, are people driving too fast? Very, very easy to collect information. I think New York City DOT has a really good model. They have a street ambassador program where their employees are trained, they're always multilingual. Their employees are trained to have very quick interactions to gain information about the needs of the community that they are in. And it's like a physical in-person presence. Something that's also has worked is your partnership with the community-based organization or nonprofits to run focus groups. They're paid, of course. People should be paid for their work. Paid focus groups, right? Those are the people with the context. They have the face familiarity. They built the trust with the community that you're looking to work with. Having them run focus groups has been successful in terms of outsourcing. You're trying to scale it. Those are some tactics that have been that I've found success with.
That's great. Somebody has also asked about how much engagement with community is expected prior to applying. And the prizes have been structured in a staged manner. So definitely having some level of community engagement plan is an important feature. Once the prizes are selected down to the phase of phase one winners, there is some funding available for communities. So I'm wondering from the panelists, what kinds of needs do the community organizations have for engaging with teams in developing these concepts that they might be able to use that funding for?
I think you need to assume that the community-based organizations are being asked by a lot of projects, et cetera, to do needs assessments and asset mapping and who are your stakeholders. So setting up the forums, the technology, the infrastructure to make those asks easy, not assuming there's a lot of hours on, there's very small teams at nonprofits. So, you know, showing your resourcing. I always also say you want to do a lot of pre-work because no one wants to read that their neighborhood is in an announcement. So I know you might be investing ahead of time a bit, but having those conversations, learning about the transportation projects in the past, very useful. I also think communities hate when you decide you're going to do a new scooter pilot and they've already done 10 scooter pilots and they're like, you should have called all the 10 scooter pilots. So also doing your research on what other things have been tested in this community, what have people already experienced, and having again, like I said, no surprises pre any announcement of any prize won.
Another suggestion that I have too is realizing that some community-based organizations, you know, they're made of volunteers. And so just recognizing that they're not necessarily going to be able to meet with you and engage with you during your business hours. You know, you need to meet them where they are, and that may be in the evening or earlier in the morning, and just be accommodating to that as much as you can, because it really goes a long way.
Great. One more thought, an intentional aspect of these prizes is replication and scalability, is being able to, you know, hopefully bring solutions that have worked elsewhere to New York State, but also hopefully have some of those solutions be applicable to other communities. Do you all have any key thoughts about or examples of projects that you think have been successfully replicated elsewhere, or tips for teams that are thinking about that aspect?
Happy to kick this off. For all the folks in attendance, I recommend the Better Bike Share Partnership. I can try to find their link and drop it in the chat, but that is an organization made up of the City of Philadelphia, NACDO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, and People for Bikes, and they provide funding to operators and community groups to develop replicable, scalable solutions to mobility issues for low-income communities of color. And something that has worked very well, and something that continues as a theme, is not reinventing the wheel. I'm sorry. And if you're thinking about a project related to mobility, related to clean transportation, someone else may have thought about that before. I think as Elle mentioned in her response, someone may have already tried it in that neighborhood. Please do your research. It's like preparing for a date. But you know, learning from the people that came before you is you can do that on your own time in terms of research. It is very important. And I think those core elements, an example I'll give is the City of Philadelphia does it's called Digital Skills and Bicycle Thrills, where their bike share system is used, membership in a bike share system is used as a way to teach adults with lower income how to use the computer and use the internet. So, you know, they help folks sign up, and that's how they learn to use those services. That model has been replicated in other cities, but it has been an intentional act of sharing information. So both sharing information on your successes, things that, you know, next time we'll do better, and also doing your research, I think are some tips to ensuring that you know, whatever comes out of your project can be used in other places.
I'm a huge fangirl of Better Black in Dallas. They're kind of a guerrilla placemaking group. They were basically they put masking tape in the road when they think there should be a bike lane, and then they count with a like a stopper how many people bike through their pretend bike lane. So I think also iteration is, are there ways you can bring a scooter or an electric vehicle to a space where you're not permanently installing? Can people sample that? So I'm a big fan of that, where communities almost, they set up these parklets and then communities are like, this is my park, but it didn't exist a week ago. So anything you can get people to start sitting in, experiencing, talking about, make it their own. I love Better Block in Dallas for that example.
You know, one quick thing that I would add is when developing a project plan, I think a lot of folks forget to include an element to basically broadcast the. It's good to have a plan for how to get the word out about what resulted from your project, because if you neglect that, then you're really you're not ensuring that even if you have a great project, if you don't have a plan for getting the word out, you might not be able to effectively do that. So think about webinars and white papers and presentations at conferences as part of your project plan.
That's great. Well, we have a couple minutes for closing remarks here, and then I'm going to wrap with some instructions for what's happening next with the prizes. Elle, do you want to start, and then we'll just have, you know, any final thoughts that you can recommend to listeners to the webinar about teaming and forming partnerships?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you know, this is a very exciting opportunity. Looking forward to seeing how it manifests. Just thinking about, you know, you're bringing individuals, you're bringing, you know, large organizations, companies together. Thinking, like we said, common ground, MOUs and finances. I agree, Steve. But also demystifying the process for other people and making a, like Nicole and I agreed, a common cause. Just really honing it down to those aligned agenda items. Because I think when things get controversial or there's, wait, what did we say? You can go back to why you're all here. But I think setting that up in the beginning is very important.
How about you, Nicole?
I think Elle and I are just on the same on the same page today. I 100% agree. I think setting out goals before you create your partnership and developing your project more specifically is very important. You know, your program will look a lot differently if your primary goal is to address connectivity to transit stations versus you know, address affordability issues of electric vehicles, right? Those are two different goals, and the tactics to reach those may look a little bit different. So I think a shared goals is, yeah, absolutely.
And last thoughts from you, Steve?
Yeah, I think, you know, my takeaway is you may be the content expert, but you're probably not the context expert as well. So I just encourage you to stay humble as you put your project together, and try to keep in mind all of the things that you don't know while you're bringing the things that you do.
Great, thank you. Good wrap up comment. So I'd like to encourage people, many of the questions that came in are related to prize logistics. So I really encourage you to go to the websites. There's a specific, if you can go to the last slide, I think has the websites on there. Yeah, so you can pose your questions at nycleantransportationprizes.org. That's the best way to get specific responses related to engagement with the prizes. We were focusing more of the discussion on the panelists here today. Look forward to any other additional questions you have, including any that came in here today. I want to remind people about the registration deadline is July 22nd. People that are, organizations that are going to prime a submission have to be registered in order to do so. Team members, all team members do not have to, but there's a benefit to you of registering, because then you'll get follow-up information. You can participate in the forum discussions and other features that are on the prize website. So I encourage you to do that. And then the next slide, there's the third content webinar that we're offering is next Tuesday, May 25th at noon Eastern, on electric fleet and mobility insights. So I encourage you all to think about joining us for that as well. And I think that is it. I really want to thank the panelists very much. Shanika, any final comments from you? I think this has been a really insightful webinar, and it has been recorded and will be posted to the websites for partners that weren't able to be here, and to remind you all of these great suggestions.
And yeah, no other closing thoughts from me. Definitely encourage everyone to register, and for the partners that you are exploring and talking to, definitely encourage them to register as well on the website so that they can also have access to the same information.
Yeah, I believe there's a partners forum on each of the individual prize websites that people can engage and also raise their hands if they want to be contacted to be part of teams. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it. And we're going to wrap this up now and end the recording.